This month, the CW is bringing us a potentially amazing new show in the form of Black Lightning. And while the character may not be that well known to the general public, he's significant in being DC Comics' first black hero with his own title, paving the way for many great heroes to come. But historically, this is going to be a hard one.
Historically, comics, pop culture in general, haven't always been complimentary to people of color. In the Golden Age, Asians, for instance, were often vilified. The Japanese, because we were at war with them, but often the Chinese were portrayed as sinister masterminds leading vast criminal empires, many of them based on, if not outright copying, pulp villain Fu Manchu. Heroic Chinese characters tended to be caricatures, such as Chop Chop from Black Hawk, or Rex Fury's assistant Sing Song, or the Crimson Avenger's partner Wing. But once in a while we also had heroes of Asian descent such as Archie Comics' Fu Chang, who, while not entirely breaking stereotype, were treated with heroism and respect. Native Americans, similarly, suffered from portrayals as savages or villains, and those that we sympathized with were often comical buffoons like Ace Comics' Tonsillitis. But there was also no end of excellent Native American protagonists like Starlight and the Green Arrowhead. And let's not forget Latin Americans. Mexicans were caricatured harshly in many comics, giving us such unfortunate characters as Chico Charlie from Nador's Buck Ranger strip, or any number of misshapen characters like Fox's Pedro. But we also get heroic characters in the mold of Zorro like DC's The Whip, and true masterpieces like Senorita Rio.
I really want to do a reading of Senorita Rio. If you're a Latin American woman who wants to do a voice for a show that can't afford to pay you, hey, hit me up.
While unflattering stereotypes certainly outnumber them by a wide margin, most non-European ethnicities can boast at least a handful of positive portrayals.
And then, well, let's just say Golden Age comics weren't kind to the African American.
Now, I've heard defenses, they caricatured everybody. Popeye doesn't look like a real white guy. And no, but nobody assumed that Popeye or Wimpy or Bluto were representations of what white people looked like. All African American characters were the same, and worse, even in well-drawn, otherwise realistically styled strips like The Spirit, the character of Ebony Black was still drawn like a cartoon.
I'm not going to try to go into the whys or wherefores or speculate on this beyond its historical context, but what I do want to do is try to figure out where it turned around.
And, well, this turns out to be less difficult than expected if we look to newspaper comics. In 1937, newspapers began running the strip Torchy Brown, about a fiercely independent black woman who left her home in rural Mississippi to pursue a career in show business. The strip was short-lived, running only until 1940, and then revived for a bit in the early 50s, but it was groundbreaking, not only starring, but written and drawn by a proud and successful black woman, cartoonist Jackie Orms, in a period before the Civil Rights Movement.
Sadly, Torchy didn't really open any doors in the comic world, and representation after that still was in the form of questionable humor strips starring minstrel-type characters and comic relief sidekicks in the form of characters like Ebony White and Whitewash Jones, and Steamboat, who was ironically added to the Captain Marvel title to add diversity.
Nope, not reading this one. The attempt to appeal to an African-American audience, and yes, they actually thought this character was going to attract black readers, backfired, and Steamboat vanished after 12 appearances.
But it was in the post-war years where things finally started to turn around.
A notable first step was from the National Urban League, whose 1947 comic Negro Heroes was a biographical anthology detailing the lives of historical figures, such as botanist George Washington Carver, Lieutenant Charles Thomas, the first black man to receive the Distinguished Service Cross, teacher and college founder Mary McLeod Bethune, seaman Charles French, who pulled a life raft out of enemy waters by swimming, actor and singer Paul Robeson, Coast Guardsman Charles David, who died of pneumonia after personally pulling nearly 100 men out of icy water, and Matt Henson, who accompanied Robert Peary on his exploratory trek to the North Pole. And the book was topped off by a text feature offering many bios of Harriet Tubman, boxer Joe Louis, Navy Cross-winning seaman Dory Miller, and singer Marian Anderson.
It's an amazing book that deserves a glance, especially if you're a student of black history. So I'm going to link the scan down in the description.
More significantly, though, 1947 gave us all Negro comics, a black publisher, all black artists and writers, in a comic aimed specifically at black audiences. As publisher Orrin Evans' introduction says, all Negro comics will not only give Negro artists an opportunity to gainfully use their talents, but will glorify Negro historical achievements. Is it good? Well, there's this, which is weird, and Lion Man, a jungle hero who isn't a wealthy white orphan raised by apes or wolves, some comedy bits, and then Ace Harlem, famed Negro detective. Ace Harlem was the lead feature. The villains, supporting cast, every character was African American. And Ace himself was a hard-boiled police detective, tough, no-nonsense, and intensely devoted to justice. A character that could have made history if the comic he headlined had ever had a second issue. In 1950, Fawcett Comics gave us Negro Romance, which I believe is the first black-targeted comic by a major publisher, but as a romance anthology, it had no recurring characters, so its historical significance is often overlooked.
But it wasn't until the Silver Age that we finally saw positive representation of African Americans in mainstream comics. And it wasn't Marvel that broke the color barrier, or DC. It was Dell.
You'll do, cowboy. You'll do just fine. A private in the Civil War, Lobo vowed to never shoot another man again after witnessing a slaughter that occurred after receiving word that the war was over. He traveled out west and became a ranch hand until he was framed for a crime he didn't commit, forcing him to be an outlaw. And though he carries a gun, he refuses to take a life. An interesting twist on the Western hero even before you consider his race. In fact, race barely came into play despite this being the first comic with a black lead by a mainstream publisher, and this in 1965. Lobo only ran a couple of issues, and although he isn't terribly well known, his presence is significant. He wasn't a superhero, but he opened the doors for the likes of Black Lightning to enter the playing field.
And so the torch was passed from Torchy Brown to Ace Harlem to a Silver Age cowboy who doesn't get nearly the respect he deserves. And that, I guess, is Black Lightning's Golden Age influence, but I'm going to take another look at Black history next month, picking up from the Silver Age and beyond.
Now, let's not do this one. That's better.